Now, to start with, I want to use a little illustration. Now, I have a visual aid here that I'll lift up in a moment that will tell you something about the stage of life that I'm at in my family. Now, imagine my wife and I got up in the morning and we went into our living room and we saw that we'd left the window open the night before, and our son's toy box had fallen over on the floor, and scattered across the floor were lots of pieces of Brio. Scattered around Brio, this wooden train set. But lying on the floor, 8 of the pieces had formed this perfect circle. They were all there, attached together, making a train set, and on top of them there was a little train. And that was sitting on our living room floor. Now imagine my wife and I look at this, and we know that our son isn't capable of doing this kind of thing yet. And so my wife says, I think we've had an intruder. I'm going to go and check my jewellery. And I say to my wife, no. What this is actually telling us is that Brio sets are incredibly common. And there's actually billions more Brio sets in the world than I'd ever appreciated, and probably more than anyone had ever appreciated. So I'm now going to go and buy some shares in Brio because I've suddenly realised they dominate the world. My wife would say, you must be absolutely crazy. Why? It's obvious that someone has been here and built this Brio railway, but you're saying that it's evidence that there must be loads of Brio in the world. And I say, oh, well, it's very simple. The thing is, what do you think the chances are that all that Brio would land there into a perfect circle? What do you reckon, 1 in a billion? She says, okay, yeah, maybe 1 in a billion chance that all that Brio would just land there on the floor and make a circle. I say, well, what that means is there must be a billion sets of Brio in the world that have fallen over, and we happen to be possessing the lucky one that formed this perfect circle. So there must be a billion train sets. Otherwise, how would you explain this just coming about by chance? Well, my wife would think she was married to a mad professor. You'd think this is absolutely crazy. And so would you, I can see from your faces. Well, that's the position that atheists were in when atheism first started to be discussed and debated, as far as we know, by Greek philosophers over 2,000 years ago. There were guys who wanted to put forward the case that everything that we can see in the world around us had come about by chance, that it didn't need a supernatural creator. Now, obviously, it's very hard to try and convince people that the complexity of this world could have just come about by chance. You know, this Brio train set, it's made up of lots of different parts that are all fitted together in a purposeful manner that allows them to fulfill the function of being a track for this little train to go round. And in the world around us, we see numerous examples. We just have to look at the functioning of our own body to see lots of parts put together in a way that's purposeful. It shouts to us that it was designed. But obviously, to be an atheist, you can't have a designing intelligence overruling everything, governing everything. You've got to put it down to something mindless, something unguided. And the only option these early atheists had was pure chance, that we are massively lucky. And the way they dealt with this was to say, well, maybe the universe is infinitely big and infinitely old, and an infinite number of worlds have formed in this universe, and we happen to be the lucky ones who are in the world on which complex life forms have come about and exist. So they're a bit like me saying, well, there must be billions of sets of Brio in the world, and we happen to have the lucky one that's formed this perfect circle on our living room floor. Well, that's where atheism was. It was guys like Democritus and Leucippus who were making that argument. And not surprisingly, not many people became atheists. And guys like Socrates and Plato were able to make a very simple argument in return and say, well, if we look at the world, if we look at the human body, for example, it looks very much like human craftsmanship, but much, much more complicated. Socrates would say, well, look at a statue. That, of course, at the time was the height of art and sophistication, a realistic statue of a human being. Look at that. And you know there must have been a sculptor. You know there must have been an intelligence who made that sculpture. Well, how much more the human body itself that statue is modelled on, how much more is the human body itself the product of an intelligent mind? And that strikes all of us as a very intuitive argument, and one that down through the ages has been seen as quite obvious. You'll know that Jesus Christ looked at the lilies of the field and he said, "Look at the lilies of the field, how they grow. Even Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed like one of these." What he was saying was that Solomon, the king of Israel, at the point when Israel was at its most rich and culturally sophisticated and full of art in its capital, at that point, Solomon the king, when he was dressed in his robes that were made by the finest craftsmen available, his robes were not like the way these flowers are being dressed. And Jesus wasn't there trying to make an argument for the existence of God. He was assuming it, but he was assuming it would be obvious to his listeners that there was an analogy between human craftsmanship and the beauty of the natural world, and that pointed to God's activity. And down through the ages, that argument has actually got stronger and stronger. As human craft and industry has got more and more sophisticated, and as we've learned more and more about the natural world, we've been able to make analogies between the latest form of technology and what we've discovered about the natural world. So the Roman Stoics would draw an analogy between a device that Archimedes had made that could predict the motions of the planets, and they'd say, well, this device made by Archimedes is clearly the product of an intelligent mind. How much more the planets themselves and the stars themselves in their motions show us intelligence. And in 18th century Britain, very famously, the clergyman William Paley looked at a pocket watch, which at the time was like having an iPhone, I guess, and said, "Look at this pocket watch, we know it's designed well, surely even more so are the mechanisms of biology designed." And so down through the ages, this argument got more and more persuasive. And today we can still use the same argument. You know, look at what we've discovered about the digital information in our DNA. We have billions and billions of letters of DNA that are a complex piece of software encoding us as human beings. We can compare that to a computer program made by intelligence within a company, a whole group of intelligent people coming together to make a really sophisticated piece of software. Well, you know, we have the same analogy, the same argument can be made. So down through the ages, this strong argument for design and this comparison with human craftsmanship seemed a very good case for God's existence. But then along came Darwin. And according to Richard Dawkins, who is one of our best-known atheists, especially as a biologist saying that evolution is making atheism tenable, Richard Dawkins says, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. He says, I couldn't imagine being an atheist before Darwin, because Darwin has solved this problem of chance. Before Darwin, atheists had to claim that everything that looks designed was just due to pure chance, and it was just astronomical improbabilities. And so atheism was untenable. But then along came Darwin, and he explains away the existence of complex biology without needing massive amounts of chance. Well, how does that happen? Well, let's go back to our analogy of this train track. I assumed that this train track must have evolved in a single go, that the pieces must have just fallen out of my son's toy box and fallen into a circle. But what if that wasn't how this came about? What if there was a process by which these pieces of brio kept falling out of a toy box? And every so often, just by chance, it is plausible that two of them might just fall on the floor like this. You might just get one connection forming. I think we could admit that's something that could happen. Now, imagine that there's some form of selecting agent that says, okay, as soon as two pieces are together, I've got a slightly better bit of railway now. I've got a slightly longer run I can do with my train than I had before, so I'm going to keep that. And that will no longer change. Even when next time these bits are jumbled around, these bits are going to stay together. Well, then after several more iterations, maybe it would be thousands of iterations, I don't know, eventually another piece might come on the end. And then you've got 3 pieces together, slightly better, and we retain that. So step by step, you gradually build up this circular piece of track. And so by cumulative selection, you have evolved a complex structure that's very unlikely to come about in a single go. And of course, life is like that. If we have generations of living things and death of the older generation and life of the younger one, and then they reproduce, we have this constant reshuffling. And so if we have a process by which we can have small changes, which is the process of mutation in our genomes, and we have a process by which beneficial mutations are retained, that's natural selection, then gradually we can build up highly, highly complex things. Now, Richard Dawkins says, and he's got a whole book about this, The Blind Watchmaker, this explains away complex biology. And it basically reduces the requirement for luck if you're an atheist. Now, if you read the God Delusion, he focuses on this as a very important part of his argument. Now, he wouldn't say Darwin disproves God, but he would say Darwin makes it much, much easier to be an atheist. And he uses this example of the Darwinian process and its apparent ability to explain away the origins of complexity in biology as an exemplar of the kind of ideas that can help to explain away God. And he says this is a consciousness raiser, that we can come up with natural processes that explain away things that we tend to think must have been caused by God. And therefore, this is a really important consciousness raiser to help us see that it might well be that we can actually explain away everything that appears to have a divine cause in the world. And so it's a very key part of his argument. But reading the God Delusion, I read it when it came out, and I've read it several times since, and I just revised it over the last few days. Reading it, as a non-biologist, you would think that this process of cumulative selection reduced the amount of luck that you need to make a complex structure by such a large amount that luck becomes negligible. Dawkins is constantly saying natural selection is the opposite of chance. Natural selection basically is eliminating chance in the process of forming a complex entity. Now, he does have a slight equivocation going on here because he keeps saying natural selection is not about chance. And that is true if you just think about natural selection as one small subcomponent of the evolutionary process. Because the evolutionary process involves mutation of DNA, it involves random drift, it involves recombination between different genomes, it involves migration between different populations, and it involves natural selection. And so if in that context, natural selection is the bit of it that is not about chance. But Dawkins uses natural selection to refer to the whole process of evolution. And so he'll say things like natural selection is not about luck. Natural selection is the opposite of luck. And I, as a biologist, think, yeah, well, that's true, because natural selection is a bit of evolution. It's not about luck. But then in other ways that Dawkins is talking about natural selection, he's clearly using it to refer to the whole caboodle. And the whole caboodle involves a great deal of luck. So to go back to our analogy, every little step involves a lucky chance which brings 2 pieces together. You have to have the right mutations arising before natural selection can act on them. And Dawkins says, yes, okay, that does involve something improbable, but it's only a very small improbability. And so we are really getting rid of these huge improbabilities. Well, it's more complicated than that. And this is very well known to biologists who work in the field, and I'm sure it's very well known to Richard Dawkins. So, for example, if I'm trying to build up a very complex railway, and let's say I get to this point by a Darwinian process, I then become stuck at this point because I have a very nice railway, it's circular, I can't build on it. So I've reached an optimum, but it's just a local optimum, because if I was able to now break this up, and if I was able to insert another piece, like someone has borrowed my other piece, sorry, if I could insert another piece like this one, which is a junction, then I've got the potential to build up something a lot more complex. But to get from a circle to something that's got a junction in, I've got to take a backward step. I've got to go back a step. And natural selection isn't going to favour that if my selection is for a longer and longer railway. And so the only way that I can get from that local optimum to a position where I open up the way for a new global optimum, I have to go backwards. And that can only happen by chance. Chance has to take me over that step. We call it a fitness trough. If you imagine a graph of higher and lower fitness, I have pretty high fitness as a perfect circle, but then I have to go down to lower fitness before I can go up and have an even more complex railway for my son to play with. And it's very well known that is an important part of the evolutionary process. You need drift to get you across a fitness trough, and that is luck. You need luck. So you need a lot of luck if you're going to gradually, by a step-by-step process, build up complex things. Another issue where you might need a lot of luck is if you do have some entities that do need several pieces to be in place before they will function, and they have to function, otherwise natural selection can't get a grip on them. You can only select for things that are functional and that are better than the other things around them, if you want positive selection to build up more sophisticated things. But if there are things where you actually do need several pieces to be in place at once, you need a lot of luck to get those pieces in place. It's like, 3 or 4 of these pieces all having to be in place before they get selected. So that needs a lot of luck as well, and it's very hard to conceive that the evolution of complex entities would not involve some steps like that. Dawkins knows this, but he's very cagey about this point. So he says, okay, if you could find examples of irreducible complexity, that is something where loads of things do need to be in place before it functions. If you could find such things, it would disprove my case. But then on the very same page he says, but to look for things like that is very unscientific. I think, well, this is a very strange thing for a scientist to say you could disprove my point by finding something like this, but to look for something like that is unscientific. Well, that whole statement sounds unscientific to me. And it seems to me incredible to think there would not be some entities where you do need lots of things in place before they function in the evolution of complexity, and that needs a lot of luck. Now, I could go on giving other examples where clearly a lot of luck is needed just for the evolutionary process to generate complex entities. But actually, I don't need to do that. I can show that Dawkins needs a huge amount of luck, even if I grant him everything he wants from the Darwinian process. If I agree with him, okay, the Darwinian process, by and large, gets rid of the need for huge amounts of luck in evolution, still, he's not in a position that's any better than that of atheists 2,000 years ago. Let me read a page to you from the God Delusion. This is in chapter 4. We really need Darwin's powerful crane to account for the diversity of life on Earth, and especially the pervasive illusion of design. By Darwin's crane, he means the evolutionary process. The origin of life, by contrast, lies outside the reach of that crane because natural selection cannot proceed without it. In order to be able to have random mutation and natural selection, you have to have a living organism that can reproduce. You have to have something that can self-replicate. Now that is going to be something that's very hard to make. Can you imagine if you sat down and you had to make a robot that could self-replicate, how difficult that would be? We struggle even to imagine biological pathways by which this could happen. It is the case of something where a whole load of things have to be in place before it does its work. So the origin of life, Dawkins rightly says, lies outside the reach of that crane of Darwinian evolution because natural selection cannot proceed without it. But he says here, the Anthropic Principle comes into its own. What is the Anthropic Principle? Well, we can deal with the unique origin of life by postulating a very large number of planetary opportunities. Once that initial stroke of luck has been granted, and the Anthropic Principle most decisively grants it to us, natural selection takes over, and natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. Remember I said earlier, he really plays down the amount of luck you need in the process of evolution, where he's doing it there. Natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. Nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified, and he'll explain more about that in a moment. For example, my colleague Mark Ridley in Mendel's Demon, gratuitously and confusingly retitled The Cooperative Gene by his American publishers, has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell, our kind of cell with a nucleus and various other complicated features such as mitochondria, which are not present in bacteria, was an even more momentous, difficult and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. One-off events like this might be explained by the Anthropic Principle along the following lines. There are billions of planets that have developed life at the level of bacteria, but only a fraction of these life forms ever made it across the gap to something like the eukaryotic cell. And of these, a yet smaller fraction managed to cross the later Rubicon to consciousness. If both of these are one-off processes, we are not dealing with a ubiquitous and all-pervading process, as we are with ordinary run-of-the-mill biological adaptation. The Anthropic Principle states that since we are alive, eukaryotic and conscious, our planet has to be one of the intensely rare planets that has bridged all three gaps. Natural selection works because it is a cumulative one-way street to improvement. It needs some luck to get started, and the billions of planets Anthropic Principle grants it that luck. Maybe a few later gaps in the evolutionary story also need major infusions of luck with anthropic justification. So he's really right back where the atheists were 2,000 years ago. He needs to try to get rid of huge improbabilities by proposing that there are billions and billions of planets that are able to support life, and we are the lucky ones who happen to be on the planet in which life has formed. You know, it's very much like me looking at this circular track on our living room floor and saying, wow, there must be billions of Brio sets, because we happen to have the one that has formed this circle on our floor by pure chance. But for Dawkins, he's not just in the same position as these atheists 2,000 years ago. He's in a harder position, because back then it was possible to suggest that the universe might be infinitely old. Today we know that the universe is not infinitely old. We know the universe had a beginning, so he doesn't have the same level of infinity that was available to these, or that they may well have thought was available to these early atheists. So he's in a harder position. Those earlier atheists also, they thought that spontaneous generation, life just arising from non-life, was something that very commonly happened. And to them it didn't seem like a massive problem. Ironically, spontaneous generation was decisively disproved in 1859, the same year as Darwin published The Origin of Species. And so now we have this whole problem of the origin of life that they didn't have before 1859. And we know today with modern molecular biology just how much complexity there is, even in the very simplest life forms. We know how they work now, and we know that they are the most amazing pieces of nanotechnology. So Dawkins, I would argue, is in a much harder position than atheists were before 1859, when Darwin published The Origin of Species. He has a mechanism which does, in theory, somewhat reduce his need for blind luck. I think he exaggerates how much it reduces the need for blind luck, but he still has, by his own admission, these huge issues where he has to invoke blind luck and the same kind of arguments about billions of planets to try to get over these problems of extreme improbability. So does evolution disprove God? Well, To my mind, absolutely not. You still have this massive problem of explaining how complex life and a complex solar system, complex universe have come about, and we are still where atheists were before Darwin, if not in an even worse position. So no, evolution does not disprove God, in my view. Thank you.